Invention is a beloved skill in Runescape 3 both due to its versatility, but also due to the item sync. So today, we're gonna answer the question, should old school Runescape get Invention? Before I actually talk about Invention, let's actually talk about the misconceptions of Invention, or rather the misconceptions of skills in general, as whenever a new skill is talked about, players usually tend to start with the elf of the game, because with Invention, for example, players want the item sync part of it. However, skills should first be fun and have a functionality, and only then should the elf of the game be considered. No skill should be developed to fix the problems with the game. To explain what I mean, I would break down skills to having generally 3 levels. Level 1, does it belong in the game, gameplay wise and world building wise? Let's take fire making for example. The skill isn't very useful, true, but it makes sense to have into the game. If you can cook stuff and you can cut trees and get logs, why shouldn't you be able to light them on fire? Gameplay wise, it's very simple, it's just a click of a button, while world building wise, well, it makes sense. Since you can already get food, why shouldn't be able to get a log while you're out there, light it on fire to cook the food? So it makes sense for fire making to exist in the game, given this level 1. Then we have level 2, which I call skill progression and rewards. Essentially, this is the nitty-gritty of the skill, the actual skill. So how do we train it, what items are involved, the rewards, the XP per hours, the GP per hours, what you unlock, how do you tie it to the game, how do you tie it to other skills and the mechanics, and essentially what place does the skill have in the game and what items does it add to the game and its mechanics. And then we have the level 3, the actual impact to the game. So, for example, does it make another skill useless? What about the power creep? Is it gonna add too many items? Is it gonna make some items useless? What are the issues essentially that the skill is going to pose to the game? And can we maybe A, mitigate them, or B, even then make it so it can benefit the game? So with Invention, you first grabbed all the, nice perks and everything, and only then did you add an item sync because you realized that you needed a way to make the skill work, and that this could actually be a good way of making it work. So really, the issue here is that old school players, when they are pitching item syncs generally, is to majorly focus on the level 3 first, and skip level 1 and 2, and then they work backwards to try and retrofit the outcome of an item sync to a skill, meaning that most skills are gonna end up feeling disconnected, they're not gonna be all that fun, and they feel like they don't belong in the game. They're gonna be extremely confusing, like warding, for example. So Invention works as an item sync in RuneScape 3 due to the rewards and the progression, not because of the item sync itself. The item sync only works because the skill is worth engaging with, given that Invention makes some stuff more convenient, it has its own content, and it's just straight up power increase. So let's talk about what actually is Invention. Now, Invention is a skill that allows you to augment your weapons and armors with perks. This is achieved by creating augmenters and gizmos to research perks and attach them to your gear. This gives more power to the players and more dynamism while performing activities in the game. As you level up, you gain more components, tools and perks that will help you throughout the game by changing the way you do combat, increasing your damage, giving choices while skilling, etc. You train it by leveling up your equipment, and to make all of this function you will need to have a charge pack with you, using divination as an energy source. And to create any of these items you actually need components, and components are gained from disassembling items. For us to understand if the skill would work in old school, we need to understand why it works in RuneScape 3, and well, first of all, it's just a straight up power increase, making it super desirable to get. Overall, it has a dynamic system that interacts with other parts of the game, such as, PVMing and skilling. It's also a passive system people would use regardless of it being a skill or not, and it also offers dynamic progression due to adding depthness to both the vertical and horizontal aspects of the game. So for example, some perks offer flat out DPS increases, while other perks offer more horizontal DPS increase, with them being focused more on, offering more damage to a specific type of monster. It gives you options due to the volume of other systems and content in the game, since RuneScape 3 philosophy is tying pre-existing content to newer content, like for example divination being used as an energy source. And obviously, pre-existing items being used for components, allowing it to be an item sink, as no new items actually have to be created, given the huge amount of items that RuneScape 3 actually possesses that don't really have many uses. Would it work in old school RuneScape? And well, personally, I don't think so, and here's why. Old school RuneScape is just too bare bones in terms of systems to tie Invention into, as Invention is tied to a lot of other systems in RuneScape 3, given that it's an elite skill. Divination serves as an energy source, there's an high abundance of items, there's EOC, and there's other skills like smithing and crafting that also aid it. Overall, there's a lack of dynamic content that is tied to other content. So, for example, in RuneScape 3, strength helps you mine stuff faster, summoning helps you do both PVM and skilling. EOC also impacts skilling and movement aside from impacting PVM, even though it's mostly a PVM update. Old school just doesn't really have a lot of this content being tied to other content in the game, as the philosophy is a bit different, and this would essentially affect how useful Invention can actually be. Obviously, the availability of some of the content present in Invention would also devalue present content, and just to give you a very quick example of that, alchemy is still a huge part of old school RuneScape, but Invention just gives you a machine that automatically alchemizes or disassembles, or gives you other types of machines that you can use that automatizes some of the things that in old school we still do manually, meaning that they become devalued over time. There's also a lack of just a dynamic power increase. So in RuneScape 3, EOC impacts how much damage you do due to the output of your EOC abilities. But these abilities are usually in a rotation, as you can just spam abilities. This, as a result, even if, for example, Invention increases 5% of your DPS, for another player might actually increase the DPS in 10% because their DPS rotation when it comes to their EOC ability rotation is just better. So there's a certain dynamic damage you have to grasp when it comes to using EOC that will inevitably impact how much damage you can do with Invention. Old school RuneScape obviously doesn't have this, which means that overall it's much harder to balance given the lack of depthness that the old school combat system presents. And to explain the lack of depthness, let me give you a metaphor, the Yuumi metaphor. Now, in League of Legends, champions have abilities. These abilities are what sometimes impacts the outcome of a fight between two champions. There is a certain depthness and, dynamism that goes into it. With Yuumi, however, that just doesn't really happen too much. Yuumi is an healer that attaches herself to allies and becomes untargetable, so there is no counterplay to her. Given that her job is to heal and shield teammates, and that she has no counterplay, her entire existence is either overpowered or useless, purely based on her stats. Invention in old school RuneScape would be the same, where if the power you gain is too little, it makes the skill too expensive and thus useless to use, but if the power is too much, it creates a huge power creep. This happens because, just like Yuumi, old school doesn't have a deep combat system that can put these types of power increases into a more dynamic state like RuneScape 3 with EOC. And to grab the League of Legends metaphor a little bit further, when other champions aren't meta because their stats aren't all that great, oftentimes they can still be counters to other types of champions because of their kit. Since Yuumi can just jump to an ally champion and become untargetable, her kit or your kit doesn't matter, and when you remove what makes fights dynamic, all it remains is the raw stats that the champions offer. And balancing raw stats to put them into a more balanced state is much harder than when you have actual things interacting with each other. Although the main question was answered, I sort of want to answer another question, which is, could it work in the future? And well, it depends. Not just how Jagex is going to expand the old school combat system, but also how the skill itself or the item sync comes into the game. For one, you could have temporary spells that enhance armor and weapons at the cost of special runes that will cost inventory slots. If balanced properly, they could pose a great choice for people that want to push damage and times at bosses at the cost of survivability. However, as I mentioned earlier, it would be somewhat hard to balance as we're talking primarily raw stats. The answer might actually lie in simply adding more depthness to the combat. Unfortunately, freeze penetration and poison penetration didn't pass the poll at the time of Desert Treasure 2, but these types of status effects might be exactly what old school RuneScape needs to make the combat system overall more deep, without having to rework it, given that, its simplicity, it's exactly what attracts people. Ultimately, if a skill can be an item sink, then great, but you should start designing a skill at the point of, is it fun, and what does it add to the game, and only then should you ask yourself if it can do anything for the health of the game.